The Ryzen 9 9950X3D is AMD's gaming king as well as their productivity king. It's a CPU that's meant to do the best of both worlds. Now, the good news here is that it actually is living up to that claim this time around. However, in the past, when I took a look at the Ryzen 9 7950X3D, for example, I was really unimpressed because that CPU, when it came to gaming, a lot of the times it would utilize the non-3D cache gaming cores, and then you'd get lower results than, say, the 7950X, which it was meant to beat. But then when it came to productivity, the clock speeds were also significantly lower to the point where your productivity scores were significantly lower too. And so this led me to recommend people back in the 7000 series either just get themselves a 7950X and focus on their productivity more and still get good gaming results, or just if they're mainly gaming heavy, just go out and save some money and get the Ryzen 7 7800X3D. However, fast forward to the Ryzen 9 9950X3D and the situation's actually completely changed to the point where I'm very impressed with both the gaming performance and the productivity numbers. Because we know with the Ryzen 9000 series this time around, you're actually able to overclock the X3D cores this time around, where in the past, with the 7000 series, for example, those X3D cores were pretty much just locked to a specific frequency. Trying to change them pretty much resulted in crashing and blue screens. And so they've kind of changed that this time around, not just to give you more performance with the 9800 X3D, but also give you a much better experience with the Ryzen 9 9950 X3D. So in today's video, I'm going to be comparing the Ryzen 9 9950 X3D versus the Ryzen 7 9800 X3D with side-by-side comparisons in games so you guys can get an idea of just how well this thing performs and just how much performance would you be missing out on if you just went with, say, the dedicated 8-core 3D cache gaming chip versus this 16-core hybrid right here. And also when it comes to productivity, how much are you missing out on versus the 9950X itself? And here's where we'll start off with the gaming benchmarks first, where I've included both 1080p and 4K numbers. Now, I'll talk about some of the intricacies with the whole test setup during these gaming benchmarks, as well as some things that I did find odd in behavior, which is actually some really interesting talking points here. And first of all, let's start off here with Marvel Rivals, which actually ended up being a very slight victory for the 9950 X3D at 1080p low settings. Now, I also tested this at 4K high settings too, and the numbers were slightly better at 4K as well. And this is mainly due to the fact that I believe, as you can see in the side-by-side comparison, the 9950 X3D is actually running at a higher clock speed. But also you notice that I've put 2 extra indicators on this monitoring software for the 9950 X3D. You notice that the core loads there are not being split off to that second CCD. In other words, the gaming performance is working how it should be. Now here's where I'll quickly interlude and say, and you're probably be wondering at this point, why am I holding this SSD in my hands? Actually, when I got this review press kit in from AMD themselves, they sent me this SSD with Windows 11 preloaded onto the drive. And in the reviewer's guide, they're like, well, Windows 11, it's the 24H2 update. You got to use this. And here's where I know from experience, Windows 10 has just done a better job. And so I actually did some further digging into this, where I'm also going to release a Windows 10 versus Windows 11 video for the 9950 X3D as well as the 9800 X3D. And the results will be pretty interesting there because I also decided to test one more thing on top of that. And here's where AMD will claim that the 9950 X3D, all the advancements were due to perhaps their chipset driver that they included, and that's the version 7 update. But here's where I personally found when I moved over to Enterprise, especially with Windows 10 versus the latest Windows 10 with a schedule update, that was where the performance on the 9950 X3D started to then move off to the non-X3D cache gaming cores. So in other words, the Windows 10, the latest scheduler, as well as the Windows 11 latest scheduler is the reason why I believe now the games are functioning 100% without having to use something like Process Lasso, which is an independent program that can assign cores and threads to certain games. So you can make sure that that game's not using the non-X3D cache cores, for example. And so I believe with this latest scheduler update from Windows itself, coupled in with the higher clock speeds, as you can see with this next example, Fortnite, the FPS can be higher on the 9950 X3D in a lot of the titles over that of the 9800 X3D. So it's actually a pretty cool victory here that the 9950X3D is getting, because as you'll see later on in the productivity numbers, does do exceptionally well there too. However, that being said, the 4K numbers, this is where the 9800X3D actually came out just a little bit on top for the average FPS. And then moving on to Counter-Strike 2, this is in particular a big reason why I'm using Windows 10, because I'll give you guys a little hint. Windows 10 for Counter-Strike 2 as well as Fortnite, it absolutely smashed Windows 11 out of the park. It was a non-comparison. But here's where in this particular title though, perhaps AMD wanted me to use Windows 11 because Windows 11 actually showed better FPS for when I did the test there for the 9950X3D over the 9800X3D. But at 1080p low settings, here's where you can see the 9800X3D scoring a victory over the 9950X3D. 773 FPS versus 745. Now, up until this point, the 0.1% lows have been quite even across both the CPUs. And this is actually a trend that does continue, and it's across all games. So the 0.1% lows are excellent across the 4K, the 1080p numbers. The X3D chips do a great job of delivering that really smooth gameplay experience. The next title here was Riftbreaker. Here's where we saw then the opposite from Counter-Strike. We had a victory for the 9950X3D. This also continued on to the 4K numbers as well. The move on to Baldur's Gate 3, 1080p low settings, we saw a slight edge go to the 9950X3D. And then also at 4K, this was also the same scenario. And then the final title that we're pulling up for you guys is Come Deliverance 2. And here's where on Windows 10, I yet again saw another victory for the 9950X3D over the 9800X3D. Now, of course, you'll notice that the 5200-ish megahertz on the 9800X3D, you can actually manually clock that up. And if you do, you'll then start to get numbers that are pretty much matched in the games where it does fall a little bit behind. Then also the Counter-Strike 2 numbers do actually go up a little bit more. Also at this stage, you may be wondering, what about the Precision Boost Overdrive numbers? If I throw in a negative curve, can I get some extra performance? And here's where for the productivity, yes, but for the gaming, actually not really. At least the games that I tested here, I decided to try a -10 as well as a -15. Both these numbers, even though they netted a slightly higher clock speed, it didn't really net us any extra FPS, with Come Deliverance, for example, going up to 441 over 439. So the 9950X3D, this time around, it's done a really good job of giving out some impressive numbers, especially versus the last experience I had with the 7950X3D, which was, in a nutshell, just all over the place. So the performance here is much more consistent, and what we're seeing here in 5 of the 6 titles was actually a victory go to the 9950X3D. Now that is due, I believe, of course, mainly to that higher clock speeds that you're seeing there, but also those higher clock speeds and the extra 8 cores that are sitting there, that comes with a higher power cost. And here's where we're gaming, we see here a higher power draw versus the Ryzen 7 9800X3D. It can actually be quite significant to the point where, especially in Fortnite, even though we're getting a bit more FPS here, we're actually pulling significantly more power from the wall. You can just see that not only in the on-screen power draw, but also with the power draw numbers from the wall. Now, granted, we are testing with the RTX 5090 here, which will extract the most performance possible. And in fact, the results will be even a little bit more skewed because we're getting higher FPS in Fortnite itself. But still, when we just look at the raw CPU direct draw power consumption numbers there, they are quite a bit higher than that of the 9800X3D. So if you're gaming a lot and power efficiency is a concern of yours and you don't need the productivity that much, then perhaps you want to save some money and go with the 9800X3D. However, let's move on to the productivity benchmarks here, where we've actually got some really impressive numbers coming out of the 9950X3D. And when it comes to Cinebench R23, the poster child for productivity benchmarks, here's where we're seeing an impressive 41,432 points, at least when I tested this on Windows 10, as well as a single core score of 2,259. Now, this is only a little bit behind the 9950X, the non-X3D variant. So it's actually really close. And this actually follows through to the next benchmark we see here, Vray, where again, it's only 1,000 points behind, scoring around 52,000 with the 9950X versus around 51,000 with the 9950X3D. Moving on to Geekbench 6, here's where we actually see a victory for the 9950X3D over the 9950X. And then the Corona benchmark was a little bit behind there. I think this was the worst number I saw, but again, it's really a 2% difference. So it's not a crazy differential there between the X3D and the non-X3D variant. The next benchmark, and the final one that we're going to pull up here, is the 7-zip benchmark. And this is where we're getting a 6.5% uplift in raw performance, the balance of compression and decompression. So that was really impressive to see that the 9950X3D is beating the 9950X in this particular benchmark by quite a sizable margin, especially when I contrast that to the experience I had with the 7950X3D. As I said before, the gaming performance was all over the place, and the productivity scores when I tested that, they're actually a big drop behind the 7950X. Now, the power consumption for the productivity, here's where in Cinebench we measure the power consumption both from the wall and with the software. And pretty much here, the from the wall figures really just cross-reference to make sure that those software figures are accurate. And here's where we've got around 200 watts direct draw from the CPU itself. And we contrast that to the 170 watt TDP that AMD said on the slide. It's going a little bit over that. So 200 watts isn't that bad with the CPU, considering the temperatures here in a 21C environment. We're going up to around 73 degrees on a 420 mil water cooler. So temperatures were still in check at these 200 watts. And also the power draw over the 9950X non-3D variant was actually not that much higher as well. So summing up those productivity scores, you're actually getting very close to a 9950X a lot of the times, and sometimes even beating it. And then for gaming, you're also beating out on average the 9800X3D. However, the power draw is higher in both instances because we do have that 3D cache on board, and that's not really helping a lot for productivity. But then for gaming, those extra 8 cores that are non-X3D are also sitting there, and they're not helping for the power consumption either. The last thing to talk about here is the Precision Boost Overdrive. When we dropped this down about 15 steps in the BIOS, we then picked our Cinebench score just up over 42,000 points. And it also slightly lifted our single core score too. Now, when it came to the clock speeds, we've got two different ways of looking at this. We've got the AVX2 heavy instruction set loading up the CPU. This is when the clock speeds bounce around 4.7 gigahertz. With the Precision Boost Overdrive and Negative, it goes up to around 4.8 gigahertz. Hence where the extra performance comes from. But then for gaming, you got anywhere from real world speeds going from 5.4 gigahertz to around 5.6 gigahertz. So really high clock speeds when it comes to gaming, and really good performance when it comes to productivity. And so up until this point, everything looks like it's amazing with the 9950X3D, and that's because it actually is in terms of its performance. I was really impressed by what I saw here today and what I've tested. Definitely a world of a difference compared to the last time I tested the 16-core X3D variant, which was the 7950X3D. Now, I think people will be upset that it's not a 16-core all 3D cache chip. However, keep in mind that even if that was the case, you don't want the 16 cores being utilized across 2 CCDs in games. That's just going to, a lot of the time, create lower FPS because it's just going to introduce higher input delay, and that's ultimately going to give you lower frames in your games. So that's one thing to look out for, right? You want those 3D cores doing just the gaming when it comes to that. But then if you're number crunching and you really need the grunt, you can then spread it across all 16 cores. And so that's the basis for the chip in a nutshell. Though with all that aside, now it's time to talk about the most important thing, and that is the price. Now, here's the weird thing. AMD in their presentations and everything, lately, they just haven't been talking about price much. And this was actually a funny thing with the 9070 XT launch. I was just in their pre-briefings before NDAs lifted. They're like, does anyone have any questions? And I'm asking straight away, how much do these things cost? How much are they going to come in from? How much can people expect to pay for the 9070 and the 9070 XT? And then their answer was, more on that later. And same with this. There's no pricing anywhere. And I was told, not even from AMD themselves, this thing's going to cost $699 MSRP. So it's going to come in from that at least. And I do laugh there a little bit because we're seeing that with a lot of these MSRP prices, things have been very distorted lately because this is using obviously that high performance TSMC silicon, and that is in a lot of demand at the moment in terms of the AI customer. And so they're eating it all up. And so what you've even seen on the 9800 X3D, because that was selling so well, you saw that go out of stock, and restocking that thing was actually a hard task for AMD to the point where the prices went up on the 9800 X3D. So whether this thing comes in at $699 or not, remains to be seen. After the 9070 XT launch, that sold out extremely quickly. So after all that, it remains to be seen what the actual street availability is like for this CPU. I'm going to sort of sit back and just take a more conservative approach and say, look, do you really need this CPU? If it's the CPU that you've been dreaming of, you want the best gaming, and then you actually need the 16 cores, then it's going to be a good option. But for me personally, for instance, my main focus here at Tech Yes City is actually video editing. And when it comes to using Adobe Premiere Pro, I actually really only need 8 cores, 16 threads, because that's what my workload, that's really all I'm using and utilizing. And I've checked this actually quite recently. I don't need a 16 core. And for instance, when I tested out the 9950X in Adobe Premiere Pro, I was getting weird issues that didn't exist with the 9800 X3D. So for me personally, the 9800 X3D is a better buy. And so I'd go with that. Not only am I going to save money, but it's better for what I do. And so the main thing for me with a 16 core and my recommendation is, do you need 16 cores? And if so, for what tasks? And then outside of that, do you really need the high FPS that the X3D can give you over the non-X3D variant? Because let's be honest, the 9950X, its gaming performance is actually pretty good anyhow. So if I'm gaming at 4K, which I do, I enjoy my games, I'm not really that competitive nowadays, even though in the last few months I actually got to Divine level on Dota 2, which was a really cool accomplishment, because back in the day, I believe I got really close, but I never got to Divine. But anyway, that was actually at 4K. So I wasn't even playing at 1080p, and I wasn't trying to just maximize my FPS. I was just enjoying the game. And so basically, the X3D chips, in my opinion, they exist for the people who really want to get that competitively high FPS. I think that's the main appeal with them. And so this leads us to the final question of, are you that competitive at your games? And then do you need the 16 cores outside of that competitiveness? And I think if you're that potential customer, you already know the answer. And in fact, I think it's actually still going to be quite a small niche of people who actually need a 9950 X3D as opposed to people who maybe just want it. But that being said, I think AMD have made a pretty smart move with the 9950 X3D in two different mannerisms. And what I mean by this is, the first is that they've given the higher clock speeds this time around to the 9950 X3D on the X3D cache portion of the CPU, and that's led to actually higher FPS. So if you were to disable 8 of the cores, if you were just a really hardcore serious gamer, then you'd be getting the best of the best for this point in time. And so that would maybe be a little advantage that I guess some people would want to pay money for. And then there's the second thing, which I actually believe a lot of this is to do with the scheduler on Windows 10 and Windows 11 finally being vastly improved over the previous releases. The second thing is that this CPU is now working just pretty much perfectly, at least from the testing I did here. So it's functioning incredibly well, and I deliberately decided to test it on Windows 10, and I wanted to see if these problems existed on Windows 10, but I was also not surprised to see that the FPS was still better than Windows 11, which, again, video coming very soon, but also I wanted to really test it on a different motherboard than the one AMD wanted me to test it on. So they wanted me to test it on an X870 with a particular BIOS. I tested on an X670E from ASRock, and that was the Pro RS, and the results here were actually excellent. And so I'm not exactly sure why AMD is so worried about how people are testing things to the point where they're sending out preloaded Windows 11 24H2 drives. But regardless of that, people are, I think, coming to this video because they want to see the best of the best from the 9800 X3D and the 9950 X3D. And so, yeah, I'm not gimping it with Windows 11. So sorry there, AMD. But anyhow, we got a bit off topic. 9950 X3D, actually a solid recommendation this time around if it's $699 and you need 16 cores. That's the main purpose of this. You need the 16 cores, but then in your free time, you want a game with the absolute best FPS competitively. I think it's a weird niche, but it does hit the spot, and I can recommend it if you fall in that niche. But outside of that niche, there's also other niches which this thing will fulfill, and that is you'll have the biggest something on the block, and you can tell everyone that you now have the best CPU, bar none. I think AMD knows that. And I think this time around with the Ryzen 9 and the 9950 X3D, people go check out the benchmarks, they're going to see that this thing is indeed the best. So I think AMD have ultimately achieved their objective with the 9950 X3D, but the most important thing is it's a good product. But I think the amount of people that truly need this thing, I don't want to be accused of just blatantly promoting consumerism, which is why I'm trying to put the brakes at the end of this video, put the brakes on it, because yeah, I don't encourage just going out and blowing your money when you don't need to. And trust me, tech, it can quickly add up. You can blow your money on a lot of things in the tech industry. This Audio-Technica headset, in hindsight, being exactly one of those purchases. But hey, I'm not immune to this stuff either, which is why I'm trying to put the brakes on. Anyhow, guys, hope you enjoyed today's review of the 9950 X3D. If you have any questions or comments, be sure to drop them down below, and I'll catch you in another tech video very soon. Peace out for now. Bye.